How did people sail into a world of darkness, where the sun barely rose, the stars vanished behind cloud and snow, and the sea looked the same in every direction, yet still arrive at the right shore? For the Vikings, winter navigation was not a matter of luck or superstition, but a quiet mastery of observation, memory, and discipline, refined over generations that learned to read the north when light itself became scarce. In the northern winter, daylight shrank to a pale window, sometimes only a few hours long, sometimes none at all. Snow blurred landmarks, fog swallowed horizons, and storms erased the boundary between sky and sea. Yet Viking ships still moved along coasts, crossed fjords, and sometimes ventured into open water. They did so without compasses, without charts drawn on parchment, and without the modern idea of fixed coordinates. What they carried instead was a mental map built from stories, experience, and shared knowledge passed from helmsman to helmsman like an inheritance. Navigation began long before the ship touched water. A Viking sailor learned the shape of the land as a child, not from drawings, but from repetition. Coastlines were memorized as sequences of events. A headland after 3 rowing songs, a cliff shaped like a broken tooth, a fjord where the wind always shifted. These were not abstract points but lived markers tied to time, effort, and sensation. In winter, when visibility failed, this internal map became essential. The helmsman did not ask where he was on a chart, he asked how long the ship had been running, how the swell felt beneath the hull, how the wind pressed against the sail. The sea itself was a guide. Vikings distinguished between different kinds of waves, noticing how swell patterns changed near land, islands, or underwater shoals. Even in darkness, the motion of the ship told a story. A long, steady swell meant open water, while confused, rebounding waves hinted at nearby shores or reefs. In winter, ice. Floes added another layer of information. Thin ice scraped the hull with a whispering sound. Thicker ice resisted the bow, and drifting fragments revealed the presence of colder currents or sheltered bays. These subtle cues replaced visual landmarks when eyes could not be trusted. Wind direction was one of the most reliable guides during dark months. The Vikings named winds not as compass points, but as living forces associated with regions and weather. Certain winds carried the smell of land, resin, or seaweed, while others were sharp with cold from inland ice. Sailors felt wind on their faces, listened to how it hummed through rigging, and watched how snowflakes moved across the deck. In winter twilight or full darkness, these sensations mattered more than sight. The helmsman steered by keeping a familiar wind on a familiar cheek, adjusting course by memory rather than measurement. When the sky was visible, even briefly, it offered clues. Vikings knew the seasonal paths of the sun, understanding not where it rose on a compass, but how high it climbed and how long it lingered. In winter, the sun's arc was low and short, but its position at certain moments still indicated direction. Even on overcast days, experienced sailors could sense the sun's presence through cloud, noticing subtle differences in brightness across the sky. This sensitivity was not mystical, it was trained perception, sharpened by years of watching weather decide survival. At night, stars were useful only when the sky allowed them. The North Star, when visible, provided a fixed point, but winter clouds often hid it. Rather than relying on a single star, Vikings recognized constellations as moving shapes, understanding how they rotated through the night and across the seasons. They did not need pinpoint accuracy, they needed consistency. If a familiar star pattern stayed where it should relative to the ship's course, they knew they were holding steady. When stars disappeared, they returned to other cues without panic. Birds played a quiet but important role even in winter. Certain seabirds rarely strayed far from land, and seeing them in darkness at dawn or dusk suggested nearby shores. Their flight direction mattered as much as their presence. Vikings watched how birds moved before night fell, storing that information for hours when nothing could be seen. Even the absence of birds could signal danger, hinting at open sea when land was expected. Smell and sound became navigational tools in winter darkness. Land announced itself with scents carried on wind. Smoke from hearths, damp earth, forests buried under snow. Sound traveled farther over cold water, and the distant crash of waves against cliffs or the echo of surf inside a fjord could be heard before anything appeared. Vikings learned to listen, not casually, but with focused attention, separating meaningful sounds from the noise of wind and rigging. The ship itself was part of navigation. Viking Longships were responsive, flexible, and alive underfoot. The helmsman felt changes through the steering oar, sensing resistance that hinted at current shifts or shallow water. In winter, when visual warnings were scarce, this tactile feedback was critical. A slight change in pressure could mean drifting off course, prompting immediate correction. Navigation was continuous, not a series of checks against a map, but an unbroken conversation between sailor, ship, and sea. Memory anchored everything. Winter voyages were rarely exploratory. They followed known routes between familiar points. These routes were preserved in verse and story, making them easier to recall. A saga might mention a journey not to entertain, but to encode knowledge. How long a crossing took, what dangers lay along the way, what signs appeared before landfall. In darkness, recalling such details could mean the difference between safe harbor and disaster. Knowledge was communal, refined by many voyages, corrected by failure, and reinforced by survival. Time itself was a navigational measure. Vikings counted hours by the body rather than instruments, using rowing rhythms, fatigue, and hunger as rough markers. In winter, when days were short, knowing how long one had been underway mattered more than knowing exact position. If a crossing usually took a certain span and that time had passed without signs of land, the helmsman adjusted course or prepared for the unexpected. This temporal awareness compensated for the lack of visual confirmation. Crucially, winter navigation was cautious. Vikings did not charge blindly into darkness unless necessity demanded it. They hugged coastlines when possible, sought shelter before full night, and read weather with conservative judgment. Experience taught them when not to sail, a skill as important as knowing how. The absence of compasses did not mean recklessness. It demanded restraint and respect for conditions that could not be controlled. As winter deepened, ice reshaped familiar waters, forcing constant reassessment. Routes that were safe in autumn became lethal in midwinter. Navigators adapted by using narrower channels where currents kept ice moving or by waiting for specific wind conditions that cleared passages. These decisions relied on accumulated seasonal knowledge rather than fixed directions. The sea was not static, and neither was Viking navigation. All of this meant that navigating winter darkness was not a single technique, but a layered system. When one sense failed, another took over. When the sky vanished, the sea spoke. When sound faded, memory guided the hand on the steering oar. There was no moment where a Viking sailor said, "Now I am lost," in the modern sense. Instead, there were only moments of uncertainty, managed through skill and patience. This approach shaped the Viking mindset. Navigation was not about conquering nature with tools, but aligning oneself with its rhythms. Winter darkness was not an enemy to be defeated, but a condition to be understood. The lack of compasses and maps did not cripple them. It forced them to become more attentive, more flexible, and more deeply connected to their environment. And yet, even with all this knowledge, winter voyages carried risk. Storms could erase every sign at once, leaving sailors with nothing but instinct and faith in experience. In those moments, navigation became an act of endurance, holding course through hours of blackness, trusting that land would appear where memory said it should. That trust, built from countless successful journeys, carried Viking ships forward through nights that seemed endless, setting the stage for the methods and tools, simple, ingenious, and often misunderstood, that would later emerge to aid them when nature offered no guidance at all. The deeper the winter grew, the more navigation became a matter of endurance and subtle decision-making rather than clear direction. Once daylight faded into a brief gray glow or vanished entirely, Viking sailors relied on systems so ingrained they felt instinctive. These systems were not written down, yet they were remarkably consistent across the Norse world, from the sheltered fjords of Norway to the open North Atlantic routes leading toward Iceland and Greenland. One of the most critical skills was maintaining a steady course over long periods without visual reference. The helmsman stood exposed at the stern, feeling the ship's movement through his legs and arms. He learned the true run of the vessel, how it behaved when correctly aligned with wind and swell. Any deviation, even slight, could be felt as a change in vibration or resistance. In winter darkness, this physical awareness replaced sight. Steering was not about pointing the ship toward a visible destination, but about keeping its behavior consistent with what was expected on that route. Currents played a larger role in winter than in summer, and experienced navigators accounted for them without calculations. They knew where tides accelerated between headlands, where river outflows pushed against the sea, and where cold currents carried ice from distant regions. These forces could quietly pull a ship off course in darkness. To counter them, helmsmen adjusted their heading preemptively, aiming not where they wanted to go, but where the ship needed to point to arrive there. This understanding came only from repeated exposure and shared memory, reinforced by elders who had sailed the same waters for decades. Cloud cover often erased celestial guidance for days at a time. In such conditions, Vikings relied on changes in weather patterns as directional indicators. Storms in the North Atlantic typically moved along predictable paths, and the direction from which wind and snow arrived hinted at larger atmospheric movements. A sudden shift in wind during winter often meant proximity to land or the passage of a weather front. Recognizing these patterns allowed navigators to anticipate changes before they became dangerous, adjusting sail or course while there was still time. The color and texture of the sea itself offered information even in low light. Winter water differed in appearance depending on depth, current, and proximity to ice. Darker, heavier-looking water suggested deeper channels, while lighter, broken surfaces hinted at shallows or submerged hazards. At night, these differences were sensed more than seen, perceived through the ship's motion and the sound of water along the hull. A longship moving into shallower water produced a distinct change in echo and resistance, warning the crew before grounding occurred. Ice was both a threat and a guide. In winter, floating ice often followed currents that also traced coastlines. Observing the direction of drifting ice helped navigators infer unseen landforms. Where ice gathered and slowed, shelter was often nearby. Where it streamed quickly and uninterrupted, open water likely lay ahead. Vikings learned not to fear ice blindly, but to read its behavior, using it as another layer of environmental information in the absence of light. Human coordination mattered more in darkness. Navigation was not the helmsman's burden alone. Lookouts listened for surf and ice, rowers felt changes in resistance, and even those not directly involved in steering shared observations. A murmured comment about a smell, a sound, or a shift in wind could alter decisions. This collective awareness reduced the risk of error when individual senses were strained by cold and fatigue. Winter navigation was a communal effort shaped by trust and discipline. Fatigue itself became a navigational hazard. Cold, hunger, and lack of sleep dulled perception, making mistakes more likely. Viking crews managed this by rotating duties and maintaining strict routines. Even in darkness, they followed rhythms of work and rest tied to the body rather than the sun. These routines stabilized judgment, ensuring that critical decisions were made by sailors who were alert enough to interpret subtle signs correctly. Shelter planning was an integral part of winter navigation. Unlike summer voyages, winter routes were chosen with known refuges in mind. Navigators memorized bays, inlets, and fjords that offered protection from storms and ice. Reaching these places did not require exact positioning. It required recognizing the signs that indicated they were near. The sound of waves changing pitch, the wind softening, or the swell flattening all suggested shelter ahead. In darkness, these signs guided ships toward safety long before land was visible. Stories and oral knowledge continued to guide navigation during these moments. Certain dangers were remembered not as coordinates but as narratives, a reef that claimed a ship. During a harsh winter, a bay that saved another from a storm. These stories were not merely cautionary tales. They were practical memory aids. In darkness, recalling such stories helped sailors anticipate what lay ahead and act accordingly. Knowledge survived because it was meaningful, tied to human experience rather than abstract instruction. There is evidence that Vikings used simple aids to support their observations, even in winter. Sunstones, crystals believed to polarize light, may have helped detect the sun's position through cloud, though their use was likely occasional and supplementary. Such tools did not replace skill. They extended it slightly when conditions allowed. The primary reliance remained on environmental awareness, not devices. Winter navigation also benefited from restraint. Vikings understood when to stop moving. If conditions became unreadable, wind shifting unpredictably, ice closing in, darkness complete, they sought shelter rather than pressing on. This decision-making discipline was a navigational skill in itself. Knowing when not to navigate prevented disasters that no amount of skill could overcome. Over time, this accumulated expertise created a culture of navigation that was resilient to uncertainty. Sailors did not expect perfect information. They expected ambiguity and trained themselves to function within it. Winter darkness became a known state rather than a terrifying unknown. Confidence came not from certainty of position, but from confidence in process. As routes extended farther into the North Atlantic, this approach proved effective beyond familiar coastlines. Even on longer crossings, where land was absent for days, navigators applied the same principles, holding steady against wind and swell, tracking time, watching birds when they appeared, and trusting patterns learned from previous voyages. Winter made these crossings more dangerous, but it did not fundamentally change the method. This ability to navigate without fixed reference points shaped Viking expansion. It allowed movement during seasons when others stayed ashore, creating advantages in trade, exploration, and warfare. Winter darkness, which limited most maritime cultures, became a condition the Vikings could endure and, to some extent, exploit. By the time a ship finally approached land after a winter voyage, the crew often sensed it before seeing it. Changes in swell, the smell of earth, the behavior of birds, and the calming of wind all converged into a single understanding. They were near their destination. Navigation, in this sense, was less about finding land and more about recognizing when it had already been found. This recognition did not end the journey. Approaching shore in winter carried its own dangers, and the final decisions, where to land, when to enter a fjord, whether to wait for daylight, were as critical as the voyage itself. The skills that guided ships through darkness now guided them towards safe arrival, setting the foundation for the final phase of Viking winter navigation, where ingenuity met the limits of endurance and the sea's patience finally gave way to land. By the final stage of a winter voyage, navigation became an exercise in precision shaped by restraint. The sea had been crossed, the darkness endured, and now the challenge was to transition from survival to safe arrival. This phase demanded as much skill as the journey itself because winter coastlines were deceptive, reshaped by snow, ice, and swollen tides. Familiar shores could appear unfamiliar, and a single mistake near land could undo weeks of careful navigation. Approaching land in winter required patience. Viking navigators rarely rushed toward the first sign of shore. They listened to how the waves changed as they met rock or sand, noting whether the sound was sharp and crashing or dull and rolling. Cliffs produced echoes that traveled far across cold water, while low beaches softened sound. These acoustic differences helped sailors identify the nature of the coast before they saw it. In darkness or heavy snowfall, this ability was essential, preventing ships from being driven onto unseen hazards. Currents near land were read with heightened attention. In winter, meltwater from rivers and shifting ice altered familiar flows. Navigators felt these changes through the steering oar and adjusted course incrementally. The goal was not to reach a specific point, but to enter a known safe zone where the environment became predictable again. Fjords, with their sheltered waters and reduced swell, were particularly valuable. Recognizing the subtle signs of their entrances, changes in wind, smoother water, or altered echoes, marked the successful conclusion of a difficult passage. Once shelter was reached, navigation did not end. Winter demanded careful selection of anchorage. Ice movement could trap ships or crush hulls if chosen poorly. Vikings observed how ice accumulated and drifted within bays, choosing locations where currents kept water moving enough to prevent freezing solid. They also considered exposure to wind, snow accumulation, and access to fresh water. These decisions reflected a broader understanding that navigation extended beyond movement. It included knowing where to stop. On land, the same navigational mindset continued. Routes between settlements in winter followed frozen rivers, coastal ice, and sheltered valleys. Sailors became travelers on foot or sled, carrying their knowledge of landscape and weather ashore. This continuity reinforced their mental maps, connecting sea routes with land routes into a single cohesive understanding of the region. Winter darkness blurred the boundary between maritime and terrestrial navigation, making both part of the same survival system. The absence of written maps did not limit the accuracy of this knowledge. Instead, it made it adaptive. Routes changed as conditions changed. A harbor-safe one winter might be avoided the next due to ice buildup or storm damage. Oral transmission allowed this information to update continuously. Elders corrected younger sailors, stories evolved, and mistakes were remembered vividly. This flexibility was a strength, allowing Viking navigation to remain effective despite environmental variability. Ritual and routine also played a stabilizing role. Certain practices marked the completion of a voyage, securing the ship, offering thanks, sharing accounts of the journey. These rituals reinforced memory, embedding navigational lessons into communal experience. Winter voyages were retold in detail, not as heroic exaggerations, but as practical case studies. Each retelling refined collective knowledge, ensuring that hard-earned lessons were not lost. Over generations, this culture of navigation influenced ship design. Long ships evolved to handle winter seas, with shallow drafts that allowed beaching on snow-covered shores and flexible hulls that absorbed impacts from ice and waves. These features were not designed in isolation, they reflected navigational realities. A ship that could be quickly hauled ashore or turned easily in confined waters reduced reliance on perfect conditions, expanding the range of safe winter movement. Psychological resilience was perhaps the most critical component. Winter darkness tested morale as much as skill. Navigators maintained calm through predictability and shared responsibility. Fear was managed by routine and trust in process. This mental discipline prevented panic when signs were unclear or conditions deteriorated. Confidence was not bravado, but the quiet assurance that there was always something to observe, something to interpret, even when nothing could be seen. The success of this system becomes clear when considering the scale of Viking activity in the North Atlantic. Reaching Iceland, Greenland, and beyond required sustained navigation across featureless seas, often under winter skies. While such voyages were rarer in deep winter, the skills developed during shorter winter passages made them possible. The same principles applied, extended over greater distances and longer periods of uncertainty. Misconceptions often portray Viking navigation as reckless or primitive, dependent on luck. In reality, it was conservative and methodical. Decisions were layered, based on multiple signals rather than single indicators. This redundancy meant that the failure of one cue did not result in immediate disorientation. The system was resilient precisely because it did not depend on any single tool or observation. As compasses and charts eventually entered Northern Europe, they supplemented rather than replaced these methods. Even then, sailors continued to rely on environmental reading, especially in high latitudes, where magnetic variation and poor visibility reduced the effectiveness of instruments. The older skills remained relevant, passed down alongside new tools. Winter darkness continued to demand attention and humility regardless of technology. In the broader context of human navigation, the Viking approach represents an alternative path, one rooted in relationship rather than abstraction. Direction was not a number or a line on paper, it was a lived understanding of wind, water, and time. Winter amplified this relationship, stripping away visual certainty and forcing reliance on deeper perception. By navigating successfully through winter darkness without compasses or maps, Vikings demonstrated that navigation is as much cultural as it is technical. It depends on how knowledge is shared, how experience is valued, and how uncertainty is managed. Their achievements were not accidents of history, but the result of a coherent system adapted to one of the harshest maritime environments on Earth. When a Viking ship finally rested safely through the winter, secured against ice and storm, it stood as proof of this system's effectiveness. The voyage had been guided not by drawn lines or spinning needles, but by memory, observation, and collective discipline. In a world where darkness dominated and landmarks disappeared, the Vikings found their way by learning to see without light, navigate without instruments, and trust a knowledge shaped by generations who understood that survival at sea begins long before the journey and continues long after the sails are lowered.